Okay, so before we begin, I want to take a moment to ground us. I'm speaking from Hamilton, Ontario, on land covered by the Treaty of Between the Lakes and the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This land has been cared for by Indigenous peoples since time immemorial, and it continues to be home to Indigenous communities today. I name this because harm reduction, overdose, and survival do not exist outside of colonialism. The systems that criminalize drug use, create housing insecurity, and allow people to die are the same ones that are built on land theft, displacement, and ongoing violence against Indigenous people. As a former drug user and harm reduction worker, I've walked along Indigenous communities as they have been disproportionately targeted, over-policed, and abandoned by the very systems that claim to protect us all. Acknowledging the land also means acknowledging that overdose deaths are not accidents. They are political decisions made within colonial systems that decide whose lives are worth saving and who gets to live or die. If you are listening and this feels heavy, you're allowed to pause. You don't owe anyone your pain or your attention. Take care of yourself first. This podcast exists to tell the truth about what's happening on the ground and to honor the people we've lost by fighting for something better for the people that are still here. And yeah, so today's guest is somebody very important to me, a friend of mine named Heather. Yeah, you wrote about years spent as a street-involved drug user, beginning very young, and later you went into working frontline and harm reduction in Vancouver's downtown east side. How has that lived experience shaped the way you think about overdose care and community advocacy?
Yeah, thank you. So first, I'll just I think it's helpful that I introduce myself and give like a little bit of context so that it all makes sense. My name is Heather. Live in so-called Surrey, British Columbia, mostly from the downtown east side in Vancouver, living on First Nations. I always just really appreciate when you shared in the land acknowledgement too, and how we wouldn't even be here today to talk about drug policy and the violence of it if it weren't for colonization and white supremacy, right? And so what we talk about, whether it's about harm reduction or prohibition, all of the things, it's all the legacy of the colonial violence. And, we think about displacement and, street sweeps that are predominantly impacting people who use drugs, right? And those are all just tiny side effects of something much bigger, right? And that's the white supremacist regime and colonial violence. My ancestry is Norwegian, Sami, and Welsh, and my kids and my partner of 15 years are Dene and Cree. And so who am I? It's always so hard to like really articulate it in the best way, but the way that my journey started was I lived a pretty tumultuous childhood, and at a very young age, by the time I was 12 years old, I had left home, right? And I ran away essentially, or I kind of moved out on my own, which is when you think about my son's 12 years old, and it's really crazy to think about because he has this narrative where he's like, I want to stay with you forever. And he's not in a rush to grow up like I was, but I ended up leaving at 12 and originally went to move in with another family to go to school in the bigger town, but that turned out to be really a lot of stuff happened there, and very quickly I ended up using unregulated drugs. So I started using crystal meth, which started from Dexedrine. And the funny thing is, I might go into some like weird side stories, so I hope that's
That's
okay.
okay. That's okay. It's your it's your
Yeah,
podcast.
yeah,
I'm just
yeah.
giving you a platform I'm
Good.
just here.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you. So yeah, so when it started with substance use, of course, like I still even struggle with completely understanding what drove me to start using substances, but it was just an escape. Like that's really what it was. And I want to acknowledge that not everybody's story of substance use comes with that traumatic backstory, because substance use, as we will talk about throughout this session, is super broad and it's nuanced, and some people use substances for pleasure and creativity and stuff like that, but we also can't ignore the way that trauma does have a correlation with substance use, and for me that's what it was, right? So I had to deal with a lot of really difficult things at that age, and I think when you have a 12 and 13-year-old brain, you can only comprehend so much, right? And I'll get into some of those details as we move through too, but just to start talking about my journey. The first time I ever like was high at school because I was in a middle school at the time in grade seven. The seventh grade teacher somehow knew I was high. I mean, I think it was obvious that I was high, but she somehow figured it out, and I was like, yeah, I took some pills, whatever. And she took me into a room, a secluded room with no windows, to watch this film called Through a Blue Lens, which, if you're familiar with that, it's really exploitive, and it's
Yeah.
just propaganda, right? It's something that glorifies the police in the downtown east side. Anyways, she made me watch the show, but all it really did for me was like, I was like, oh, I want to go there. Like, what the hell? Like, why am I here?
Yeah. Like, wait, there's more out there?
We're out there because I was obviously experiencing a lot of really fucking horrible things and adversity, but it, like at 12 and 13 years, you just don't have the language for that, right? And it wasn't a time where you were really talking about mental health either, right? This is in the early 2000s. And anyways, there's a point to this small story here. So I did that, and then I just continuously became like targeted by the authorities in the school and just labeled a deviant, right? So it wasn't too long from there where I started using crystal meth right before my 13th birthday. And something that I always like to say, and it's going to fit very well with our conversation, is how the typical narrative of substance use is shame-based, right? So we talk about a deviant behavior or effectiveness, especially in the context of Narcotics Anonymous. We often think about like, oh, what are my defects of character, stuff like that. And a lot of it's based in yeah, it's based in shame. And I'm trying to think of another word.
Like penalization. Like,
Yeah,
yeah.
like you're a bad person, whatever. But something that when I reflect on 12, 13-year-old Heather using crystal meth regularly, I think that it was actually a natural response and a really resilient response actually to some really horrible things, right? And so of course when that happens, when you end up emerging within those spaces as a 12, 13-year-old girl, you have to grow up really fast. Right. And, the first murder I witnessed was a street brother of mine when I was 13. Right. And so experiencing that just continues more of that trauma. And then it carries a snowball, and then more shit happens, and then having to survive at that young age at the mercy of really, really shitty men. Right. And so many different things would just continue to fuel my substance use as a way to survive those things.
And a lot of people don't frame it as a survival tactic. It's more like it's a coping mechanism for people when you, like, for example, I talked about this in a podcast or interview with, I think, Ann Livingston or something like that. It's like, of course I'm using meth when I'm outside. It increases my body temperature. It makes me more aware. It keeps me awake for days. It's like you literally have to survive.
Well, yeah, and that's another thing, right? It does. It keeps you awake, and for me, it also gave me that gift of gab that I needed to survive, right? And, a little bit context of who I was before that. I was living with undiagnosed autism and ADHD. I didn't know what the fuck those were back then, right? And I didn't even discover that until I was about 26 years old, but I carried this I just felt like an alien, right? Like I didn't feel like I fit in with anybody, and I just didn't develop in the same way because of the neglect that I had experienced in the home as well as a young kid. And looking at my mom now, for example, I see her for who she was as a product of her own intergenerational trauma. But back then I just carried a lot of resentments, and I wanted to be as far as away from that my biological family as I could. So a lot of that substance use was also to cope with the impacts of that, right? Crystal meth was like that friend that I had always needed, right? Because it gave me everything that I always wanted to be, and I didn't understand why I was different from other people. And like I always just never felt like I related to people, like just so much happening, right? And anyways, going back to that, like just more of like the linear journey, I was always on my own. I was criminalized. There was a time where I was held in complete segregation for almost 2 weeks with no shower, no human contact by the Penticton RCMP. And of course, like, what does that do to you? Like that's going to impact my entire worldview of safety and so much more. And so many of those things that showed up in my life really just continued my substance use, right? Because it's all I had, right? Like at least I had that, like the
That
medicine,
control. Yeah.
right? And even though a lot of the time it was the way that I attained it was always through having to manipulate and do things, but that was how I survived, right? And so relying on different people and men particularly. And anyways, what was I saying? Yeah, so I ended up going from there, from Penticton at the time to, it was Penticton, British Columbia, to the Vancouver, right, which was the downtown east side, right? And so there was some time in different cities around there, but just fast forwarding to about 2007 is when I ended up in the downtown east side. Um, and there, that's where like that was it, right? Like that's where I kind of like grounded. That I didn't leave a 4 block radius for many years, right? And so with that, of course, comes endless criminalization, endless social exclusion, things that are related to the poverty machine, right? And survival that isn't always exclusive to substance use, but it's all often goes hand in hand when you are unhoused and you're surviving. And I ended up leaving the downtown east side in 2013 when I was pregnant with my son now, right? My relationship with drugs at the time, I was like, oh, I'm just quitting and, followed an abstinence-based model, whatever. Even that I didn't always kind of fit in with. But um, now the way that I look at it is just my relationship with drugs has ebbed and flowed, right? And we'll go into a little bit more through like what my substance use looks like now. But
Yeah.
anyway, right as soon as I gave birth, I ended up in harm reduction, right? So it wasn't too long after I gave birth because I needed a job, right? And the interesting thing is I didn't really care about I mean, I cared about justice because I've always been a justice seeker. I've always been. I just didn't have the language for it. But I just thought I was unemployable anywhere else. I was like, I'm a fucking skid from way back. This is who I am. And the only job I was convinced from people in my life at the time was you should go work in one of these supportive housing buildings, work for the organizations, right? Like the organization that one of, good friends at the time and mentor had been working at for a while, kind of took us in. Before I gave birth at the time too, I didn't think that I was going to keep my son, right? So it was those people that were in my life that weren't biological family that kind of showed me that I was capable of being a parent and, had a stable roof over my head and stuff. And so it was them who also encouraged me to work in harm reduction, right? And it was very quick where working in the downtown east side, from emerging from being a street entrenched drug user, surviving out there for so long, and then moving into a frontline role, that's when I started to develop a sense of like, oh shit, like all this stuff that I've always been thinking about, there's language to that, right?
It's like you discover all these things and you're like, whoa, like people know that this is happening for years and years and years and nobody's doing anything about it.
Yeah. I mean, it's essentially like putting a band-aid on something, right? It's a performative thing. And I know we're going to talk about some of that, like the way that institutions have adopted harm reduction.
This is something when you were talking, I thought about this and I want to ask this too. It's kind of like the second question, but you talked about like witnessing like a murder and just like working like intense harm reduction jobs on the east on in the downtown east side and also mirroring that with your own lived experience on the downtown east side. Can you share what those moments kind of taught you about harm reduction and survival?
Like the moments of like the lived experience on the street and what
Yes.
about survival.
And then like also from like being now like a instead of like the like being
Yeah.
on the other end as a staff member and witnessing other people's survival, like what did
Yeah.
that teach you as
Oh,
well?
no, that's good. I'm gonna really think about that carefully because I know I have an answer to that. That's a lot of the survival. I mean, I've always seen it as survival, right? Like it's never been like the bad people over there, right? Because like, interestingly, I was raised literally. Like I didn't have no prom, I didn't have no fucking family. I was raised by the streets, right? So I think that puts me in a more unique position where I didn't think about those things like other people did. And like, for example, people who took care of me the most, who protected me. At the time, I would have hated to say that somebody was protected me because I was like little man syndrome. I was like, don't fucking, I can handle my own. But the truth is there were people who did protect me when I was
And
really
that's how
young.
you have to be when you're out there.
Yeah.
You have to be like,
Yeah, and exactly. And yeah, that's the whole thing. But the people who protected me, the people who had my back, are people who have been convicted of murder, right? They're the people who got busted in $1 million raid after they built up their fucking drug empire, right? Like these are the people that were viewed as the deviants of society, who were all I knew, who I learned every value that I have, right? So even when I was 14, before I came to the downtown east side, I had a trap house, a guy who ran a trap house. He was a Jamaican drug dealer. His name was Casper. He had one eye, and he was the guy who taught me a lot of the values that I have today. And he actually helped me escape from a really, really harmful, predatory man, right? And Casper never expected anything from me. He kept me well, and I did, runs for him or whatever, but he was like kind of like a father for me on the street, right? But so that's where it puts me into an interesting perspective in how I perceived things when working on the front lines in terms of survival, right? So when I started working in those spaces, I immediately became like insubordinate, I guess, because some of the things that would be flagged for, no dealing in the building, which is bullshit, right? Like,
Yeah, like what do you mean we're sharing?
and so it was actually, so I guess I could say also how that impacted my advocacy in changing policies, even, right? So, for example, like it didn't make sense to say, oh, this person sells drugs in the building, so he needs to be evicted. We need to put this on because there's this entity called BC Housing here in British Columbia, and that's like the general funder for all the housing programs. And so when you have like when your name's on a file in BC Housing and it says that you're a drug dealer, you can't get more housing, right?
Yeah, that's
So I didn't
ridiculous.
completely change that, but I did influence quite a bit of like what do you call that? Like practices within those programs to be like actually so changing that perspective, right? So this is why lived experience is so important too.
Exactly. Yeah.
A person who sells drugs within the building is actually the person who's keeping people alive, right? He's that person. And so what happens when that person gets busted? Well,
Mhm.
another supply is going to come circulating and it's very likely going to be even more potent, right? And it could potentially kill. And we've seen that happen. And there's
Yeah.
actually that shows that,
Yeah.
right? There's study, I think was it Brown or Howard University that showed whenever there's a drug bust actually impacts overdose deaths within the proximity, right? So it's stuff
Yes.
like that. So that did very greatly influence the way that I showed up in a harm reduction lens. And then, one of the first things that I asked when oh, this actually drives me crazy. When I was just about to get into the work, I said, "Well, I want to do everything, but I'm not going to call the cops. I'm sorry." And then the person who was mentoring me was like, "Well, I'm sorry, you're going to have to get used to that. You're going to have to call the cops." And I'm like,
You're gonna have to get used to me not.
I didn't, right? And I don't think I ever fucking did because I remember um, I never did, right? Because I just wouldn't buy into that. I always had this anti-carceral lens too, right? That I carry now. But again, I didn't have the language for it, right? My disdain for police was straight up street code at the time. But then it turned into being an abolitionist. So the
Yeah.
other thing there is that harm reduction is supposed to be anti-carceral and abolitionist. However, we know that harm reduction has become completely sanitized by the state and by public health and stuff like that. And so I think the little ripples that I was able to make in spaces where my voice was valued was always driven and influenced by my lived and living experience. And I've been to university, like I'm working on my degree right now. And as far as it stands now, I'm sorry, but nothing compares to the way that I moved through the world with my lived and living experience, right?
Yeah.
It's
No, I
even
agree.
de-escalation and stuff like that. And my God, I never have talked about this, but I'm going to tell you. There was this time where I was working in a clinic in the downtown east side, and it was during a time. So it's going to show how my lived experience impacted something. And it's
Yeah,
happened
go for it.
kind of draw up on that too. So it was a time, was it just, and I think it was like the peak of the pandemic, and things were getting really bad. And there was this guy that I knew who didn't for somehow didn't get what he needed, right? He was denied what he needed, and that was essentially like safer supply, right? And he was desperate. And I hadn't seen him in a couple years, and he came with his pit bull. And I see him walking across the street where I was standing up vaping or something. And he had his pit bull with him, and he had this mesh bag. And I could tell there was a gun in the mesh bag. And I'm like, but at first I didn't notice it, but I'm like, hey, I'm not gonna say his name, but I said, hey, let's call him Joe or whatever. I said, hey Joe, how's it going? Long time no see. Like I haven't seen you in forever. Oh my God. And he was like sweating bullets. He wasn't in a good mood. And I was like, oh shit, okay, something's going on here. And then I noticed the mesh bag and it looked like he was gonna go rob a place. He was gonna rob the clinic that I was working at. And I was like, is that for here? You know, I work here, right?
You're like, hey, like, can I go first? Like, can I go home first?
No, no, I mean that could have if it
No,
came
I'm
on.
just joking. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I wouldn't have. So the first thing I said was like, hey man, like I said, there are like really good people in there, man. Like I know these people and like they're really well-meaning and so it just turned in like I started realizing that what he needed was dope, right? And he needed to get high. See, there was like maybe a dry spell or something. He wasn't able to get what he needed and he was broke. So I probably stood there with him for 30 minutes asking him to not go in there. And he finally at some point he's like shaking. He's like, fuck you, Heather. Why did you have to be here? And I'm like, dude, I get it. I fucking get it. Like anything that you need from me, like what do you need? I gave him $20. You know, even that would only last him a little while, but I mean, it stalled him from doing something. And I was sweating too. I'm like, dude, like, come on, like, we can't do this. I don't, like, listen, I've done some shit in my life. I have done home invasions to survive, I've robbed places. I used to do B&Es. Like, this shit is not new to me, right? So when I kind of, even without him telling me what he was going to do, like, I knew. And nobody knows that to this day. Like the people who I worked with, I never told, right? Now, if they watch this podcast, they'll know. But this is like 5 years ago now. So
Yeah. Plus,
it doesn't
if you
matter.
change your mind about me wanting to put this in
No,
there, I can take it out.
I don't think that it'll identify him or anything like that. But I think that wasn't the only time that stuff like that happened, right? There's been many
Mhm.
times within working in harm reduction spaces. And so just to be clear for the audience too, I am very careful when I talk about this kind of behavior because this can get weaponized, right?
Yeah.
And so depending on who I'm talking to, I don't even mention some of this stuff because sometimes I worry about people's capacity to hold nuance, right? And this is where that nuance comes in,
Hmm.
right? I'll be the first to say, as I just mentioned, like because I was living in poverty, because I was denied access to resources that normally would be given to me as a youth, but I was a substance user. I had no other choice but to survive through crime, right?
Yeah.
And that's what I hope the listener will know. It has nothing to do with somebody's moral compass and has everything to do with survival, right? And I always like I said, like even sharing this now, I really hope that it doesn't get taken, somebody uses a clip and says, "Oh, look what they say," and I want you to post this and I do want it out there, but until you have been in desperation, not it has nothing to do with drugs either. It has to do with poverty and systemic exclusion. Until that happens to you, until you are in literal dire straits, like I think that we wouldn't understand what that feels like and what that is. I also know that it doesn't just harm one person, right? Like those things harm everybody involved, including the person doing it, right? And so because of that nuance and because that person that I had run into that day was denied of what he needed, because this wasn't just him waking up in the morning being like, hey, I'm gonna go do this thing. This was him trying to access services
Yeah, in the only way he knows how.
in the only way, but he also was like denied because that's when they started giving out safe supply because I was helping do that like within the outreach program that I was on, and then suddenly some physicians decided to pull back, right? And so I guess that's where that guy ended up, facing so much rejection, right? And especially when you're thinking about the way that the unregulated market has evolved, right? Like this is really strong fentanyl with benzodiazepines and medetomidines and other additives that is really hard to manage those withdrawal symptoms because of the unpredictability of it. And so when that happens, when you can't get what you need medically because the system's not designed for you, you will feel no other choice but to do something to achieve that, right? To get what you need, right? And so though going back to how harm reduction and my lived experience kind of shaped the way that I move, also so sometimes they would, the general messaging would be like this thing is not possible. You can't do this thing. Or, I've never operated in a harm reduction environment completely following the rules to a T, right? And that goes into how harm reduction and the history of that. Do you want to just talk about that too?
Yeah, like the everyday reality of harm reduction work versus how it's like put on paper and
The way
inflicted
that
in
it's
policy. Yeah.
Yeah, the way that it's sanitized, right? And so giving a little bit of a history rundown, every single thing that we know today about harm reduction would not exist if it weren't for Black, brown, queer, disabled organizers who use drugs demanding for change, right? Taking part in different forms of civil disobedience. And you talk to Anne Livingston, like she's the OG from Vancouver.
I know that was so cool.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's her and other people across, Turtle Island and beyond who are predominantly Black, queer, and racialized who took matters into their own hands, right? Because all forms of revolutionary change emerge from people who are most affected both by harmful systems taking action and resisting the status quo, right? And so that started with acts of love, right? It started with bleaching syringes because something was in the blood that was causing people to get sick and die during the peak of the HIV crisis before medication, right? So people would bleach their syringes
Yeah.
as an love and an act of camaraderie, right? And makeshift syringe and needle exchange programs weren't, this public health brilliant idea. Like nobody in public health wanted to do that. It was people who use drugs on the front lines living these things, right? And so it was all radical. It was all acts of resistance. And it was, we are doing this whether you like it or not, and we're going to keep coming back, right? And as Insight, for example, opened up, right? And Livingston, I'm sure, spoke about that, where that happened in 2003. And that wasn't because, this act of benevolence by the state. It was because people showed up at fucking City Hall with fake caskets and demanding for change, right? And so after Insight, more research started coming out, as we know, right? And there's endless evidence and research that shows harm reduction works, that shows not only overdose deaths, but HIV, Hep C rates. Vancouver was the highest HIV rates next to sub-Saharan Africa, right? And then, with the emergence of needle and syringe
Yeah,
exchange,
harm reduction, stuff like that.
then those numbers went down, right? So because of that, of course, because of the need, public health adopted harm reduction models, right? And in some places it was more progressive than other places, but essentially the entities that did adopt harm reduction as their models, especially in Vancouver, for example, like all of the nonprofit housing organizations, like that's where I started, it was just housing first and harm reduction, right? So the housing first model is basically the idea that people deserve housing whether they're drug users or not, whether they live with a psychiatric diagnosis or not. And, things end up falling into place once those needs
Yeah, like house people first, worry about recovery and all these things.
or whatever that is, right? And it does show in the proper environments and the proper conditions that it works. And it so happens to be that when you operate a nonprofit from funders, you're funded by a larger entity, then you are required to follow the rules and the expectations of those entities. And then what happens? Harm reduction becomes sanitized, right? Harm reduction turns into a neoliberal practice.
It becomes like professionalized.
No, exactly. And I think about the nonprofit industrial complex, and my friend Tyson Singh wrote a really good article about that, and I'm sure he can speak to this too. But, when you think about harm reduction inside systems, it becomes like surveillance, it becomes containment, it becomes a conditional care, right? I talk a lot about conditional care too, right? It's funny because, it just seems like sometimes those entities that adopt harm reduction language and practices, they just barely scratch the surface, right? It's just, okay, we're keeping people alive. That's enough, right? To avoid political consequences, right? But then, if you disrupt anything, if you for example, like so many ridiculous rules I would refuse to follow when I was working in those housing buildings, and I would get labeled as insubordinate. But I'm like, it's actually more harm reduction center to let a person who doesn't live here do their laundry. You know what I mean? Like, why does that happen? And the question is always, who makes these rules and where do they come from, right? Because harm reduction, essentially, for the listener, in a nutshell, it's just harm reduction has become sanitized and neoliberalized, I guess, to fit within the socially acceptable parameter. And I kind of lost my train of thought again.
Like it was never supposed to be like that. Harm reduction was never supposed to be some professional, like it's supposed to be nuanced. It's supposed to be subjective. It's supposed to meet the person where they're at. It's not supposed
Yeah.
to be rigid and have rules. I'm supposed to figure it out as I go because I'm reducing harm for the moment at hand. And like sometimes that doesn't have like a manual that you can follow kind of thing,
That's
right?
exactly well, exactly. And I've always said, like, even before I had all this language, I said there's no room for black and white, or there's no room for binary in harm reduction, right? Because it turned into these spaces of surveillance and carceral, because then what happens is you get people who come in to do the work, who then work again. My experience in this was working in supportive housing buildings with safer using sites in the program, and just very chaotic environments. But a lot of people who come to sign on to do this work, they end up essentially just acting like correctional officers.
Yeah, it's like a savior complex. Like you come in instead of working with people, you're trying to change them.
And well, yeah, that, and also just acting like cops, right? Like, breathing over the tenant's shoulders about every little tiny thing that person's doing, and, enforcing very rigid rules, or like following maybe unregistered guests in the building, and like really egging them on to become defensive and angry. Or like, I've seen, a woman who's quite vulnerable, at risk of abuse and violence, who, just succumbed to her abusive partner's manipulation. The partner was barred from the building, but the woman lived there. And then she was like, she just, for her own safety, just let him in. She ended up getting evicted. This was an Indigenous woman. It's like, this is the shit that I mean. Like, this is like systemic gaslighting, that you're a person. Because what often happens is people, because of the society that we're in, they get really hungry for power, right? And so whether you're in a clinical setting, so I worked in both clinical healthcare and then, supportive housing, and whether you're in any of that, I think that, when you sign on to do harm reduction, if you haven't read a fucking word of theory or organizing, or, some of the history of that, then you need to get your shit together.
Like a lot of the places, sorry to interrupt you, but a lot of the places in Ontario are like that too. It's a lot of, and I don't care about religion. I don't care about these things. Like, not that I don't care, but I don't disrespect these things. Like, you know what I mean? But it's a lot of Christian people who come in as missionaries who want to spread the word of God and change and help and save people. And it's like, we don't need your saving. We need access to resources so we can save our fucking selves.
Who
Like,
said
that's what I'm saying. Like, and then Anne Livingston said something because her manifesto that they created for Van Du, it has something like, I have the right to get
Yeah,
high
yeah.
and like stuff like that. And it's like, why is that not like, why do these spaces not have manifestos like that instead of policies and procedures to follow? You know what I mean? Like, why is it not? But that's, yeah, I guess like the whole end of what we're talking about is that it's because they have to sanitize it to be digestible for like the political view and the people who are like in power to accept it.
To yeah, make it palatable, right? Never listen. Like, I was just kind of overseeing a conversation that was happening on Instagram just about exactly this, right? I think when we are pandering to the ruling class and the language of the ruling class, who gets left out of that? Right? That's the question. And there's a lot of people who get left out of that. And, when you echo kind of what Van Du does, like, they are completely self-governing, right? The experience I have with that is working in heat shelters here in Vancouver, where, it was a little bit more like more wiggle room to be more people centered, where when the heat shelters open, we would create a committee of the tenants, right? And so the rules were actually created by the people who lived there, right? So you'd see people who weren't typically hanging out together, like they would never be caught together hanging out, but they would come together and as comrades and community members to create a collective manifesto, essentially, right? So the success of that was always so much better because it was created by the people, right? You see this with drug user organizing, drug user liberation groups, stuff like that.
Yeah, you're connected with like community efforts like the Drug User Liberation Front and like broader ideas of drug user self-determination and just like basically, and use the word unions. How
Yep.
would you define how would you define drug user liberation and why is it necessary to have this idea beyond traditional harm reduction models?
Yeah, well, I think it just says it right in the word, drug user liberation, right? So we're not actually liberated when we are at the mercy of the state, right? And we're having to be palatable. We have to be a picture perfect version of whatever they want us to be. They pick and choose who is the face of those movements whereas drug user liberation, it means people who use drugs get to control the conditions, right, of their own survival, right, including supply, care, community. They're not asking permission from medical or carceral systems, and that's essentially what Dolph did, if you're talking about Dolph in particular.
Well, in Dolphin.
Yeah, so with Dolph, earlier I said all forms of revolutionary change emerge from people who are most affected. Dolph didn't just show up out of the blue being like, we're gonna do this radical thing. They showed up because they fucking asked a million times because we have been screaming from the top of our lungs what the answer is to 3,000 deaths in so-called Canada. Right? We have been citing research. We have been elevating voices, right? Bonnie fucking Henry, for those who don't know, Bonnie Henry is the provincial medical officer of British Columbia who literally recommended with the coroner, Lisa Lapointe, who's a fucking badass, by the way. She ended up having to step down because I don't blame her.
Yeah,
They
the heat was too
recommended.
much.
Yeah, no,
Yeah, I seen that.
they both recommended safer supply, right? And the answer, although a lot of this shit is very complex, the answer to this is far more simple, right? So point is, Dolph and other drug user liberation groups across the province were echoing the same shit that we've been saying for fucking decades, right? So with Dolph, they were asking for this. They were asking for support from the government, even though like fuck the government. Yes, I don't have any illusions that the government will ever have our backs, right? The government is all for capital and property and power, right? But we asked for changes in legislation, right? It was never enough though. So Dolph said, fuck it, I am done watching my loved ones die. They took matters into their own hands. They created a community-led compassion club for community by community. And it was a rigorously tested supply of heroin, cocaine, and meth that was largely monitored and regulated within that entity. And they distributed it to people who were registered. And the success was great. The success was
Like literally astronomical.
astronomical, right? And I was around then and I would take part in the marches. And I remember even Eris would invite me to meetings. And I was like, oh, it's just my son was so young at the time. And I was like, I want to be here. But I was still involved in my own way, just less like I
Being
wasn't.
a mom is the most
Yeah.
revolutionary thing you can ever do.
I was there and I was like, I know Eris from working at the heat shelter that I was talking about. I worked with her there too. But
Have you been in contact with her at all since this has happened? Like,
oh yeah.
do you
Yeah,
think they would be willing to do something like this, like to speak on this if they
I
were
don't know
allowed
if they'd
to?
be allowed. I don't know if
Okay,
they,
yeah, they probably
but
can't. It's not
yeah,
worth the risk. Let's wait till shit happens.
we'll
We
wait
find
until
out what
that.
happened. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I
So
would
that
love to meet with them. Like, seriously, they're
yeah,
amazing.
for sure. I'm sure that they would when the time comes. But right now, I think they got to keep a bit of a low
For
profile.
sure. For
But
sure.
so what they did was they took matters into their own hands. They did exactly what Vendu did back in 1998, right? Vendu demanded change. Vendu took matters into their own hands and probably talked about the unsanctioned overdose prevention sites that they had even then, right? And the success was great. But the other thing with Dolph is that they were really transparent with the state, right? They were transparent with the police. They were transparent with VCH, Vancouver Coastal Health.
Yeah. It's not like they didn't ask. It's
No,
not like they weren't aware.
no, everybody was aware, right? Everybody was aware and was okay with it until it became politically convenient because then the conservatives started bringing in this rhetoric around, moral panic essentially with substance use and safer supply. And the best target was Dolph, right? Anybody because there was no overdoses that were related to the distribution days.
Oh, I muted. I was gonna say exactly. That's what I think a lot of people don't recognize is that nobody died from that supply. And the whole all we want to do is stop people from dying. We'll worry about the criminality and all the other things that everybody's worrying about. The whole like, oh, what about the safer streets? It's like, okay, we will have safer streets when we have less bodies dropping
Well,
in it.
like, what
You
is
know what I
this?
mean? Yeah,
We have
exactly.
a
Like that whole
conversation
aspect.
about who's actually unsafe.
Exactly, exactly.
Um,
But it's like the people who are unsafe are the ones dying of toxic drug overdose.
Yeah, because I have, even though I'm from the downtown east side, like I spent so many years out there, when I go to the downtown east side, I'm the safest person there, right? Because
Because you escaped.
I'm not getting, no,
Not escape.
I'm not getting patted down. I mean, maybe, but because I've been pulled over a
Mm.
lot there, but I'm not at risk of violence like my comrade is who sleeps outside, you know? So who's actually
Yeah,
unsafe, right? And whose safety is more important, and that turns into another conversation. But with drug
exactly.
liberation groups, what it really means is, you know, we are the experts of our own lives, right? And something I'm actually gonna do my own little recording. I'm doing like voice recording on another thing, but what something that I said was, you know, if you're thinking about society's obsession with controlling and, you know, infantilizing people who use drugs, right? So if you are going to use a
Yeah.
disease model, right, in healthcare and call it substance use disorder, which has been defined in the DSM for since 1952, it is one of the only disorders, with a couple exceptions, that is surveilled, punished for so-called relapse, policed, and infantilized. And we have adopted this idea with substance users that they are unreliable narrators of their own lives. When the typical person within Turtle Island is a white, you know, white middle class person, thinks about a person who uses drugs, we automatically assume that they don't know what they're doing,
Yeah.
you know, have
That was a quote in like the article I did with the Hamilton Spectator because I was so young and just starting. I was like, when we talk about people who use drugs, usually we think they're not smart, that they can't understand, and that they, and because that was like, but I said, but these people gave me some really good shit. Like they really knew what they were talking about. And
right?
like that, it's true. Like, who's gonna know more about what's
Mhm.
happening than the people it's happening to?
Yeah, people know how to dose. They know when they know what's in their supply, they know how to dose and keep themselves up,
Exactly.
right? It was the street mamas that I knew that were keeping the women involved in sex trade and the people involved in sex trade of all genders for that matter, keeping them safe, right? It wasn't the fucking state, you know, it was the mamas, the street mamas that I still, you know, I have a good friend named Mona. I don't think she would care if I used her name, but she's, you know, a really close friend of mine, and she's a Cree elder within our drug user liberation movement. And it's her who never sleeps because she's taking care of her community. She's given the women who just got, you know, had a bad date, you know, lavender to sleep put under her pillow to prevent the night terrors, right? She's the one
Yeah.
doing the people within her community, and she's up all hours of the night. She got a fucking broken hip for fuck's sakes, and she's
Poor woman.
still, you know, getting shit done to take care of community,
Because
to
who else but us? You know what
live.
I mean?
Yeah,
Who
who else?
else but
We
us?
keep it safe, right? That's where it comes
Yeah.
from. I mean, We Keep Us Safe actually came from was it Nothing About Us Without Us or We Keep Us Safe? I think it was We Keep Us Safe.
Nothing about us without us.
I was just gonna say the disability movement
Yeah.
and I forget which one. But yeah, exactly. It's always been like that. And I think that we unfortunately we've always been in fascist territory, but now with, you know, the way that people have drank the Kool-Aid, especially here in British Columbia, has
In Hamilton in 2022, we had an overdose rate 45% higher than the provincial average. In March of 2025, they shut down all but one safe injection site in the city, and it's only accessible to women and gender diverse people. So men can't access it. So the highest number of overdoses in Hamilton are men, but the
Mhm.
people largely impacted by overdose deaths have nowhere to go to access like harm reduction, basically.
Well,
That's
even that, not everybody's gonna even want to go. Like we have that
exactly.
people, but like we have the large amount of people who are missing out, who are at risk, and then we have the people who are also at risk, who maybe, you know, live in a small town and their sister-in-law works at the public health unit and they don't feel comfortable getting
Exactly.
whatever.
That actually makes me think of something. Like that kind of, what does that say about like the limits of legality versus like life-saving practice
Oh,
in Canada? You know what I mean? Like, do you know how I'm trying to say?
like natural law versus like real, like
Like, yeah,
written law.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, like we know that nothing, most legal things are not ethical, right? So I
Oh,
think
actually, maybe I should rephrase it. Like, what are the like harmful assumptions that they make about people who use drugs?
I think all of it trickles down into policy and law, right? So we think about there's different elements to stigma, right? Like I always get annoyed at the word stigma too because I think it's
Me
so over.
too.
It's like fuck, it's like yeah, it's stigma.
Even harm reduction pisses me off these
Yeah,
days. We keep
it's just all fucking annoying because it's become a buzzword and all this shit. But like, so anyways, just for the sake of lack of a better word, when you think about the elements of stigma, we have blame and moral judgment, we have isolation, we have fear, we have the idea that they're not reliable narrators of their own lives. We have, you know, medical neglect essentially, right? So some people that I know who needed a hip replacement who were denied that hip replacement because of the idea, the belief from the practitioner that they wouldn't be able to participate in physical therapy because they're a drug user. That's it. There was no evidence that showed that people who use drugs are not capable of recovering from major surgery. And so a lot of life-changing treatments too are denied. But where all of these little pieces of stigma, so when we think about, criminalization, blame and moral judgment, not reliable narrators, that what does that do? It trickles down into beliefs and then trickles down into policy and then law, right? And where does that come from? Well, it comes from drug war propaganda, right? It comes from a century worth of narratives and propaganda and media portrayals of people who use drugs, which then, it's all of those little pieces are connected, right? And so at the beginning, when the drug war emerged within North America, Turtle Island, people used drugs and it wasn't a problem, right? Humans have used drugs since time immemorial, right? And nobody fucking batted an eye at that.
Yeah, like
And
tobacco is a sacred medicine, but it's also been co-opted by the Canadian government to become a drug. And it's like, what the hell?
nicotine, yeah. And we know that, but the history of what happened with the drug war is that it was always a tool to target and contain and exclude and seclude people who were racialized, right? So it started here in Vancouver, 1908. Mackenzie King, who was a politician in Canada at the time, he wanted to get rid of the Asian population. Like he was racist. He did not want Asian people to continue coming to Vancouver. And he was unsuccessful in that until he decided that these Chinese Canadians, they're operating drug dens, they're operating
Hmm.
opium dens, and some of the narratives that are not only here in Vancouver, but it was in the States as well about Chinese people distributing opium was that they are ravaging society, they're wreaking havoc on society, and they're going to take your
Yeah,
land.
the
Yeah,
women and like
it's
I've
like
read a bunch of
yeah,
stuff about that.
to white purity, right? And so they used substances and substance use starting in 1908 and in other areas too in different pockets of the world, but it was always to control and target racialized people, right? And so then we saw Harry Anslinger was like the fucking the most well-known evil czar was blatantly racist, and he would create all kinds of propaganda against Mexican and Black people. But what happened too at the time was he actually took the global stage and he convinced other countries about this moral panic. And that created the drug war. And then, we see reefer madness. We see the Nixon and Reagan eras about the crack epidemic. Meanwhile, that was orchestrated and manufactured by the
The
white
government.
entity itself, right? And targeting Latin American countries. And then that, turned into crack and targeting Black communities within the US. And then while um, rewinding a little bit to I think it was the between the 20s and 30s, or just right, 20s and 40s, with Harry Anslinger, he was creating all this propaganda to demonize Black and brown people. But guess what? White people were being marketed those same fucking drugs for medicinal purposes, right? Cocaine for
Yeah.
toothaches,
So it's
heroin.
like if the pharmacist gives it to you, it's okay. But if the street dealers give it to you, it's like not okay. And it's like, what do the street dealers look like? And what do the doctors look like? You can
Yeah,
look back in history, the doctors are all rich, educated white men. And then the street dealers who are still giving the same drug, and back then with the same purity levels, because it wasn't a tainted supply, they're criminalized because of the color of their skin and their poverty levels and things like that. Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
and it was in line with redlining as well, right? And where Black people were only allowed to buy homes and get loans within certain more impoverished areas of the cities, right? So that was simultaneous. It's all connected, right? It's all
Yeah,
connected.
it's all a game.
Yeah, it's all connected. And so, even thinking about the 13th Amendment in the US and how slavery was never actually abolished. Like slavery was never actually illegal. It never became illegal. It just became rebranded because then it said slavery is illegal except for when you're this is me paraphrasing, except for when you commit a crime and you go to jail, then the state is legally allowed to enslave people. So what did they do? They disproportionately criminalize Black people
Yeah. to
into the
make sure
prison
that they can
system
keep
so that they would be legitimate slaves to the state working for nothing, working for
yeah.
free to build the economy, to build society, and to
All of
create
the desks in my
every
elementary school were built by people in prison. Like you could look underneath and it'll
wow.
say Millhaven Institution with a stamp. And like, what the fuck? I remember my dad was in prison when I was a kid, and I used to call my dad would call and I'd be like, Dad, guess what? My desk came from your jail. Did you build my desk for me?
That's horrible, but cute. Oh my God. But that's it, right? That's it. And so even that, like the way that I mentioned the 13th Amendment, that's all fucking connected, right? So it is not a coincidence. I'm sorry. I fucking hate conspiracy theorists. I hate them. However, this is not a conspiracy because there's so much evidence that it's just what it is. It's the white supremacist machine.
Yeah.
And so the way that Black people in the US were then targeted for the moral panic around drugs that justified inflating police budgets. It justified because of that panic. Your family's in danger. These drugs could insidiously ravage your communities, and all hell's gonna break loose. And so then what happens? Then policing is justified, right? Then drug war is one of the main reasons why policing is justified to be completely inflated in their budgets, right? And so as long as the drug war exists, the state functions because it's the same here in Canada, so-called Canada, right?
Also, I'm turning off my camera just so I can go to the bathroom, but I'm still listening to you.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I was just thinking about something else too. It was so all of that over 100 years of these beliefs and this bullshit that's been fed to people in the West. And then of course we see that in the East too. I can't speak for the global drug policy as much, but and I want to learn more about that, but it all brings us to today, right? So with the criminalization of those substances, we know that supply and demand will always exist, right? And you can compare it to the way that alcohol prohibition was framed or how it impacted communities. It didn't stop people from drinking. It just made alcohol more
Yeah, and even that was just like
yeah.
anti-indigenous propaganda, the whole idea of like regulated alcohol versus like dissing moonshine and making moonshine as like a dangerous thing. It's like, no, just because it's created naturally doesn't make it more dangerous. What makes it more dangerous is when you police and criminalize people who are creating it so that the ingredients we use are no longer safe. Like people were making moonshine with like broken records and stuff like that back in the day. Like that's not anyways, but
No,
that wasn't
exactly.
their
And
fault.
it was unregulated, but it was, yeah, there's a lot to say even about the Indian Act in Canada and how Indigenous people, I want to make sure I get this right. Indigenous people were actually, so while people were allowed to drink at the time, it was Indigenous people who were not allowed to drink, right? They weren't, it was something along the lines of white people didn't want to drink in this with Indigenous people in the bars, right? So then that became part of that. But then, as you just shared, that's the iron law of drug prohibition, right? Or of alcohol prohibition at the time too, right? So beer and ale and all these other like spirits, or not spirits, but the lower percentage of alcohol turned into spirits, and then harder liquor, stuff like that, because it was more condensed, easily distributed. And then, of course, came the unregulated supply because it was illegal. People didn't stop drinking, and then that caused people to die, right, and go blind and stuff like that. So we see that same thing happen with today, right? We see the iron law of drug prohibition, which turned opium into heroin and then heroin into fentanyl. And now what we see with the emerging metamethadone and benzodiazepines and all these different substances that aren't even approved on humans is the byproduct of prohibition and criminalization. So what does that do now? So we were talking about the way that it impacts laws. Well, what do you think anybody's going to do if they have this completely real belief in their own mind that something is so bad and dangerous, right? Because the Controlled Drug and Substances Act of Canada says that it's meant to protect the safety and well-being of Canadians, right? But how does that make sense if the safety and well-being of Canadians are actually further at risk, right? So that's part of what Dolph is fighting against in their constitutional challenge. But it's so skewed, and I've had conversations even when getting my nails done at the salon, and just kind of throw something out there about the prohibition or like what I do, and I think I asked one of my nail techs a question. I said, well, what's wrong with drugs? Because they were talking about drinking alcohol and then drugs. And I'm like, well, what's wrong with drugs? She's like, are you kidding me? Oh my God. And I was like, well, let's talk about it. And so I unpacked it and I told her what I did. And then she's like, wow, I didn't even think about that. Right. So it just gives a perfect example, though, of how the general consensus sees it. Right. I've said this with Uber drivers, right? I always talk about sometimes it's so exhausting too, and I don't want to talk about it, but sometimes I will.
Yeah.
You know, the end of an Uber ride that I took, I think my car was broken down. I had to get Uber. He did thank me at the end, but at first he was floored at some of the shit that I was saying. But again, I say that because it's just a perfect example of what people believe, right? The general belief system of average so-called Canadians and Americans and people in general is, but the other thing is, I'm going to pull up a stat that I have. I'm just going to find it in my email. Who uses drugs? Is it this one? Okay, so an estimated 269 million people ages 15 to 64 used drugs in the previous year. Less than 13% of these individuals are thought to be living with, quote, a substance use disorder. And that is based on the United Nations Office of Drugs and Crime World Drug Support. So we obsess about the 35.6 million people who qualify for substance use disorder diagnosis, while forgetting the other 233.4 million users who quietly blend in with the rest of us. And what I have to say to that too is it is arguable about even the diagnosis and the statistics on who qualifies for substance use disorder, right? So that needs to be taken with a grain of salt. But that I always found really helpful in sharing the narrative, right? In how there are millions of people, hundreds of millions of people in this whole world, in this planet, according to the data. And then obviously with data, we know that there's likely more who just live, quote, normal lives, who blend in with the rest of society, right?
Who
So
choose to use drugs.
who chooses to use drugs, right? And even then, it's like, who gets to decide who has a problematic relationship with drugs, right? And all of the devastation that we see today when we consider, so me and mine and your opinion around people who use drugs who live unhoused are obviously different than the general consensus, right? But just based on that perspective, when we think of people who use drugs and the harm based on poverty and all that, like when people are unhoused, when people have open sores and wounds, and when people are generally appearing unwell, a lot of that could be eradicated and mitigated when poverty is addressed and housing, food security, community belonging, right? Another part of the capitalist machine under this white supremacist colonial entity uh, that is North America is a lot of that is, oh my God, what was I going to say?
This whole thing is to keep people poor so we can keep them
Right.
under control,
Oh,
kind of
we
thing.
do. Yeah. So capitalist, so that's wasn't what I was going to say, but I would love
Okay,
to
okay.
on that because that's important, right? So in order for, I know two people who said this, Noam Chomsky and Dean Spade, right? They talk about how disposability politics exists within our society, right?
Mhm.
In order to maintain a functioning capitalist system, there needs to be people who are viewed as disposable, right? Who do not matter in the
Mhm.
eyes of society, right? Because those are the people who it's justifiable to pay low wages. It's justifiable to not provide housing to or resources or can go to jail and be criminalized. That is how the corporate entity exists, right? Because people need to be viewed as less important and less valuable. So that's a part of it, right? Because it goes to also say how so-called Canada functions solely off of the exploitation, the extraction, the violence of people on this land, right? The displacement of people, right? But thinking about how that ties into the devastation and suffering that people experience, right? Because it's not a lie, people suffer, right? When you think about this conservative woman on Twitter, I don't go on Twitter anymore. I fucking hate that place. But this woman who's like, I don't know, it's like conservative Barbie or some bullshit, just some fucking weirdo. She was talking about the downtown east side, like she's some expert, and said, I challenged her and she said, well, people just need to get well, right? And I said, well, what does wellness mean, right? What does it mean to you? What makes you well? And obviously she didn't answer, but what I have to say to that is, well, housing, financial security, a sense of belonging and community, within social circles, right? Isolation causes harm, right? And that's essentially what drug war does. It pushes people into the shadows. But when my needs are met, I'm more likely to, when I get a good sleep, when I'm have nutrition, when I have that financial security where I'm not stressed out about what my next day is going to look like, that doesn't require abstinence, right? That requires all those other things that build wellness because we've seen this. We've even seen this going back to drug user liberation groups. What does that do for people? Not only does it do all the things that are obvious, but it also brings a sense of community. And I've seen this with people where people have been, just struggling in their own ways, right? Where they're experiencing the effects of poverty and maybe they have some complex health issues and mental health issues, stuff like that maybe they believe that needs to be addressed, and they just feel like they're not where they want to be. As soon as they become involved in drug user organizing, that sense of belonging drastically impacts their wellness, right? Then they can find housing, then they can find, culturally safe, dignified support services, then they have access to food because they're getting paid a stipend from these organizing groups, right? I've seen it with my own eyes, how people have completely changed for the better, for their own better, right? I don't decide who's bad, who's not well, and who's ill
Yeah, you don't decide
for
what people
them.
need to get better. It's just
Yeah.
what people, yeah, what you've
Yeah, it's
witnessed.
general too, right? It's with my own life, right? Like when I was burnt out and going through some shit, like my wellness wasn't great because I wasn't providing
Same.
things that I
I
like the
went
basic.
through a literal like drug-induced psychosis and when I first started this stuff and lost all my organizing friends, like all my relationships. I had to start from the ground up because I was so burnt out on drugs, unwell, that I was abusing people.
Yeah.
And like to be able to acknowledge that now and move forward with it is like a big thing. But I wouldn't have been able to do that if I didn't have, how can, like when I think about abuse and this whole thing, like, okay, not abuse, like domestic violence and things like that. Like I'm not speaking on that. I'm speaking on like conflict versus
Yeah, totally.
abuse.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, in the streets, what is considered abuse is not what's considered abuse in like normal day-to-day life, right? Like me yelling at you in your face is
Yeah.
like normal outside and normal in Hamilton, Ontario. But when I went to Ottawa, Ontario, where everybody's in a suit and everybody's scared to say how they feel, like
Yeah.
people were labeling me as like abusive and like mean and stuff like that. But what I was doing was like advocating for my own mental health at that time in the only way that I knew how, and I was criminalized for it. But like, you know what I mean? Like that whole idea of like, yeah, wellness, like you're saying, and like what wellness looks like. My wellness might just be not using drugs today, where
Yeah.
your wellness is never using drugs in your, you know what I mean? Like it just, there's so many different aspects. But what was I gonna say? You talked a little bit about this, how you moved from like surviving in like as a drug user and just things like that into like advocacy and writing. How do you navigate being heard now in spaces
Mhm.
that you've historically been dismissed, like, or where they dismiss people who use drugs as credible sources and voices?
Well, that took a lot of years. Took a lot of years. And I felt like I had to fight a lot harder because um when I moved from working in supportive housing, which was a little more barely, you see more, punk people, more organizers working in those spaces, and then you go into the clinical setting, which started for me in 2017. I was immediately, everybody just thought that I was a volunteer straight out of detox. Yeah, you too.
Everybody's like, at one time I was at work and somebody, I had to like get them in trouble, like get them in
Yeah.
trouble. And I
Yeah.
went up to them and they were like nose to nose with me. And okay, my dad's a murderer. So like in my face, I'm like, okay, this is fucking, we're on. Okay. And so
Oh,
I'm in his face and I'm like, do you know who the fuck I am? And he's like, no. And I'm like, I'm a fucking staff. And then
yeah.
everybody's like, you're a staff? We thought you were just a fucking another drug. I'm like, no, just because I dressed the part. But anyways, the whole point is like, yeah, you like being
But
yourself can make you have labels. You know what I mean?
absolutely. Well, yeah, exactly. And I really did have to claw my way up. Like I have some stories, man. And so when I ended up working in the clinical settings as a peer specialist, I it just
Being heard in spaces.
yeah, being heard in spaces. And then you were saying something that jogged a thought too. You said something about when they, okay, so even what you just described, that shows enough of how, like, are the clients safe with those people if they are just treating you when they thought you were a drug user, that you're less valuable and that you are suspicious or whatever? Like, that's fucking wild to me, right?
Yeah.
does that tell you, right? So how are other people who are accessing these services treated, right? Because we're not more valuable than them. Yeah, so being in those spaces in the clinical settings, I continuously had to tell them, like, I've been in this work for a while now. And I'm not new, I'm not fresh out of detox. Nothing wrong with being fresh out of detox, but that wasn't my story. So many people would be like, so how long are you here for? You know,
It's like forever
yeah,
until I get fired.
stop, I'm unionized, bro. Like, can you fuck off? I
Thank
didn't
God.
desk, right? What they wanted from me when they hired me onto that site, like it was a contract between the organization I worked for, that I had been working for several years at the time. We created a new position. We were getting paid really well to be in that position as a peer specialist. It was just the same as like an outreach worker, but I was a peer, right? They didn't even give me a desk. They told me before, I didn't even know before I came there, but they told me, well, you're going to sit in the waiting room and just talk to people. What? What do you mean? I'm doing outreach. I'm doing like case planning and case management. What the fuck do you mean? Like I'm sitting in a fucking waiting room engaging with people. That makes no fucking sense.
Yeah, like this is
That's
confidential information. This is people's lives we're dealing with. This is healthcare.
appointments. Yeah, I was doing other things. Like I was doing regular outreach work. And then they were like, oh, well, we never thought about that. And so, anyways, I was in and out of those clinical settings working. And then I ended up at another clinic, which I ended up staying for 4 years. But for the first 2 years, I was experiencing endless stigma, endless double standard because like one example, like the downtown east side, it's like a very condensed area, right? And so we were just on the outskirts of it. Not the outskirts, but on the perimeter of it. And I would have like say 8 clients to see in that day to support them with their oat or with like just whatever, like different case planning things with referrals, whatever. And so there was a bunch of SROs that they would label as like you can't go there without a partner, like without a coworker because it's too unsafe, right? And I was like, I said I don't really need a coworker. Like I used to live in that building, like it was called the Brandies, and because there was a client that lived there, and they were like, you can get written up for this, blah blah blah, whatever. Next day,
Yeah, I got
next
fired
day.
from a job for like my old relationship with a client. I'm like, he doesn't even live in Hamilton anymore. Anyway, go on.
No, that's okay. No, so the next day we were in our morning meeting, and then one of the doctors, they were just talking about one of the doctors who did outreach by herself. They were like, "Oh, she's a rogue one, isn't she?" Right? So she's talking about a doctor that's like doing something against the rules, being like, "Ooh, he," and then me, they were like, "Oh, she's irresponsible. She's
Yeah.
you know." And so it was just all these little nuances and little subtle microaggressions that would constantly happen. And I was told so many times that I wasn't ready for leadership roles within that organization. That's another thing. It's like there was partly because of people were jealous of me or whatever, but then there was other, cases where I had a lot of paperwork around insubordination because I had a pre-existing relationship with a lot of people within those buildings. And when those people's needs weren't being met, or if I was, there was a couple times where this guy or this so many different cases where somebody really needed a connection to buy dope and I didn't do anything. I'm just like I just talked to the person who I knew for many years and I said, hey, there's a guy downstairs who's like really sick right now, can you go help him? And whatever, right? And that's harm
And then
reduction.
people think that is harm reduction, but it's harm reduction in the streets. But then when they co-opt and professionalize it, that's drug dealing.
Other
Fuck
thing,
off.
yeah, the other thing that actually was, I'm just going back and forth from the housing to the clinic. There was here's a perfect example of how if we followed binary rules within harm reduction, people could actually die. So I had a client who I actually talk about her in one of my Substacks. She, obviously, I'm not giving the identifying information, but she had a very bad brain injury. She was about 22 years old. And because of the brain, she got hit by a bus. A lot of people get hit by a bus in the downtown east side. So she had a brain injury. Part of her skull was missing, right? So underneath the skin was just blood vessels and brain, essentially. And she had trouble moving, had trouble getting dressed, and her speech was very slurred and, really just needed support. That she didn't get enough support. But something with her was that there was 2 men in her life that were predators, that
Yeah,
were
taking advantage of her.
literally sexually assaulting her because she said that. She said, they rape me every day, but I have no choice. It would always be a bit of a fight between one predator at one building and then another predator. And like she would stay at one place for maybe a couple of weeks and then she'd like run away and go to the other predator's place. This one guy who she ended up staying with a little bit longer was manipulating her because she was getting a settlement, maybe $600,000 or something. And then like drugging her up so bad, like where she was so incapacitated and literally sexually assaulting her. Like this is not. I'm not going to sugarcoat it.
No, like this is real life. This is what happens when prohibition impacts people's lives.
yeah. So she was a substance use. She was getting endlessly violated and abused, and we ended up with a code word. And whenever she was unsafe, because she would sometimes escape the room and then like go to the staff office and like call us secretly and just say a code word, whatever. We ended up making like a backdoor solution where I had a friend who was managing a women's safe place. And so I grabbed her, got her into a taxi, and brought her to the safe place. But she ended up realizing she didn't have any dope. She had no drugs and she was going to get sick. And so she's like, well, I gotta go back. Like, she was just constant, even though it was unsafe for her, she always felt no other choice but to go back because that's the only way she would stay well. So, like he would beat her too, where her head was very flat. Like if you hit her in the wrong spot, she'll die, right?
Yeah.
And just all these other things. So much abuse, so much abuse. It was just unheard of. And so we got her to the safe place. She's like, oh, I gotta go back, right? The only way to save her, to I don't want to say save, she saved herself. She did all this too, right? The only way that she would have stayed there, that to prevent her from getting the shit kicked out of her, not only generally, but because then she had left and he would be mad, was
Yeah.
a couple grams of fentanyl and a bottle of vodka. And what the fuck is anybody else gonna do? Right? So that's what I mean. Like we can't always fit within these expectations that are again
Yeah.
like what would happen?
Because
What's the more ethical solution to that, right? And so of course I connected with people. We pooled in some money and we got her what she needed. And she ended up staying for a significant amount of time because then that gave her time to, get her shit in order and find connections of her own, right?
yeah, and
And so
like sometimes, and like what you're saying, the professionalization of harm reduction, you could have gotten a lot of trouble for doing that, but you saved a life, and the whole aspect of harm reduction is saving a life
yeah, well, exactly. And it's
or
like
helping them save themselves.
yeah, and if the rules and the expectations are not fit within the reality, like it's just what it is, right? And
Yeah.
and I have many stories like that too, where I didn't have any other choice, and then other workers, unfortunately, they just think it's the right thing to do to. I mean, again, like I also want to humanize some of the workers as well. Like some people are just new grads, and they don't know better, or
And
they're
a
just
lot of people are fear-mongered into believing like this. So
they
I
do.
want to speak on something just for my own self because I'm okay. Anyway, I'm gonna go off a little bit because this is kind of relevant to what we're talking about. But a lot of people that work in these spaces don't understand that people like you and me, we don't have that thin line between client and staff because we were clients. You know what I mean? So these are just our community members. So this whole what is it called, like power dynamic, I understand having a power over somebody because you're in control of their
So you
healthcare, you're
still
in
have
control
power.
of their life. Yeah, I have power, exactly. Like with my relationship with a client, I lost my job over that, but the reality was I did more harm reduction work to save this person's life being in a relationship with them than this service ever offered. Like we both got sober off of fentanyl together. We switched to crack. Crack wasn't a good drug of choice for me. It ruined my life, but you know what I mean? Like that was harm reduction. I gave him a home. I gave him food. I gave him clothing. I gave him like literally all of myself and my life. And that in my head was what he taught me everything I know about drugs and harm reduction, like not just including my father, of course, but like I was so young back then, I had no understanding. But witnessing it through somebody else's eyes, especially when you're in an intimate relationship with somebody, like people calling me a client fucker. Well, I'd rather be a client fucker than somebody who criminalizes, demonizes, and literally like causes the death of people who use drugs. And like I was kicked out of that space, and I've been kicked out of numerous spaces because I openly disclose my past history. And I always emphasize like I may not be capable of working closely with men because of my own boundaries and my own like my own susceptibility and my own weaknesses. You know what I mean? So it's like I openly am and am confident in admitting that, but I'm penalized because I'm supposed to be this powerful person with a badge, with like with some sort of obligation, but my only obligation in my heart is to keep people alive. Like, does that make sense? And I
But it
feel
makes
like, yeah, the professionalization of harm reduction makes it so that people who actually know what they're doing and have like the actual history and lived experience to be able to speak on this stuff are punished and pushed out of these for people who don't understand, who end up demonizing us.
yeah.
Anyway,
I
sorry.
Yeah, no, I think that there is a level of boundaries. Like we do,
Absolutely.
and I think that it's just what it is, but it sounds like you said you knew he wasn't even a clone, like he wasn't there
He
anymore.
was like he was still a listen. The story is I'm a bad person. Okay. The story is I met this guy the first day I went into the safe injection site. I seen this man and I was like, I'm going to fall in love with him. Like I'm not even lying. I literally met him and I was like, I'm gonna fall in love with this guy. I did my best to stay away. I did my best to have other people, but he worked well with me. So they kept pushing me to him. Hey, you go work. I'm gonna say his name because he's my ex. I don't care. Fuck that guy. His name was Pat. You go work with Pat. He works well with you. Oh, you go hang with Pat. He works well with you. You keep Pat calm because he was one of those very hard to work with clients that are very angry and aggressive and da 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 and dangerous. People viewed him as dangerous. But with me, I was like, my dad's a murderer. I got you, bro. Like, I'm not scared of nothing. So anyway, and a relationship developed to where I quit my job. I quit my job before they were going to fire me because I moved him into my house in September and I quit in October. So I was still working while he was living with me and like accessing services. And I was like,
Yeah. Okay,
you know
I
what I mean?
see.
So
Yeah.
like that was like the boundary crossing. So that I understand where I did something wrong. When you fall in love with somebody, you either choose your job or you choose them. And I decided to kind of play both sides, but it wasn't that I was like his care wasn't any more important than anybody else's to me. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like if
Yeah.
he dropped, I'm not going to choose him over somebody else that dropped. Like it was never like that. And that's what I think people don't understand. Boundaries are boundaries. Yes, professionalism is professionalism, but we all exist in the same community. So we need to like rework these laws or like these policies to be like to be able to work in an actual like live setting because what happens to the next and also like I was a young girl too. He was older than me. Like what about the other hand of like the manipulation aspect of somebody who is a client emotionally manipulating the worker into having more compassion and like that's like another thing. Like I don't know why I got into this or what my point was, but it
Yeah.
basically was like policies in practice don't make sense when
Yeah.
you look at the
Like,
lived reality.
yeah, and I think that's a huge thing just generally in harm reduction, where
Yeah.
when you hire people with lived and living experience, it's just gonna come with the territory. The fact that people are gonna know people, right, from the
Hmm.
past. I just remember I saw somebody who when just was brand new into harm reduction, like 2014,
Hmm.
I saw somebody who I was friends with who was, living in a previous building and they were like
Hmm.
a you know. And I just remember the big rule being like, you can't hug anybody. And I'm like, I've given this guy a hug. Can you get the fuck out of here? I've known this person for years, and I think it's super weird where it's like you need to turn something off when,
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to say. That whole
yeah,
like
yeah,
dehumanizing people. It's like, no, this is my community member. I'm
yeah,
not going to fall in love with every client I work with or every man that I work with, but I'm going to show them respect.
yeah, and you are, and exactly, and that's like, even when it comes to pushing back on policies that don't make sense, right? Because it's extremely harmful, and you know that because you have lived experience, and then you get almost like alienated for it, but then it's like, well, you can't, like, because when I was, for example, I was working in, and I'm hoping to go back soon. I was working in one of the health authorities here and doing corporate leadership. Like I was helping, I was doing lots of strategic policy. I was doing all of the education, like educating clinicians to adopt harm reduction lens. And because we just rolled out a policy and I helped with that policy. And it was a lot of very, very low barrier, so-called radical stuff that was approved because I had an amazing leader. But at the same time, it's sometimes unsettling to people, when it comes to like how to really show up for people who use drugs and being more okay with the gray area about, one kind of smaller example is like handing out cigarettes for de-escalation, right? Whatever. Like there's so many
I used
things
to get in trouble for that all the time, but yep.
that it actually prevents harm, right? So
I
it's like
know.
thinking about that, and then sometimes it's like you got to know when and where is the appropriate time, whatever. But just whatever. The way that I educate, like for example, I revamped the entire harm reduction education for new hires. Like new hires were required within the entire health authority to take my harm reduction course.
Good, as
And
they
I
should
also
be.
created with my other coworker a history of prohibition, and then, a couple other ones like contextualizing the drug war, stuff like that. And a lot of that for people who have never really dipped their toes into this stuff, it's really unsettling for them. It really forces them to confront parts of themselves that they thought were real, or like beliefs that they had. And then that's daunting, right? And so for a lot of people, I think it takes a little bit of time. But what I was getting there was, you cannot claim to uphold lived and living experience and then clutch your pearls when it gets real, right? Because it's like one or the other. Because if you do that, then you're just tokenizing and you're just performative and you're just checking off a box, right? So it's brings into conversation of like, what does it mean to resist tokenism? What does it mean to truly bring in people with lived experience? Because the other part of that, something that I would face a few times actually, was outside agencies would, because I was the point person within the health authority for like anything peer related, but also like harm reduction and like best practice, stuff like that. So they would come to me and just send me an email or whatever, be like, hey, can we meet on Teams and talk about this thing that we want to do? We want your guidance. Some of them, I'd straight up say, you're better off not having a peer, right? Because you're just going to throw them to the wolves, right? And sometimes that's what it looks like. Sometimes, even though we want to bring in people with living experience onto every team and every program, at the same time, sometimes it's not recommended because they're not ready, right? Like if people need to be ready and equipped to bring in people with lived and living experience because of the diversity, right? So me, I have a lot of privileges now more than I did before, right? I have university, I have, home, two kids, I live a
Mhm.
stable life. But then the peer who's in a similar role that I've been in might not be as stable. They might have more complex life conditions. They might have stuff that might impact their attendance. They might have, family drama, like so many different things that the average worker might not have. So it's about giving grace and leaving room for that. Like, are you equipped to hold that space for your peers, and are your other staff competent enough to work alongside them? Because if you don't do that, then you're just going to cause more harm,
Yeah.
and you and it's not going to serve you or the person,
Yeah.
right?
Ends up
Doing
harming the person more than
Yeah.
helping them, I guess.
Yeah, and I had to say that to a couple programs, right, that were outside of where I was at, but just consulted with me, and so then I ended up creating with my coworker who did a lot of the labor with me, a peer engagement manual that was for the entire, and it's still there. I'm not there anymore, but my manual's still there. A lot of the work that I did was still there, but I felt really proud of that because it went deep into the history of like, okay, before you decide that you want to bring in peers into your team, pay equity is the huge one, right? That's a whole fight that is still ongoing because it's complicated with unions and stuff like that, where there's like certain grids of pay wages, pay grades and whatever. But start with obviously pay equity. And then, there's like a bunch of checklists that I have. So I talk about the history, giving context of, drug user liberation and what it means to do harm reduction work and who actually developed everything that we know today. And then moving into, more like practical stuff, where if you don't check off all those boxes, like to resist tokenism, to, ensure pay equity and just all these other exploitation and stuff like that, or like, policies around attendance and, maybe like
Yeah.
different
Just
diversities.
making the policies in place actually work in practice for everyone involved and not just the overseer or the person in charge.
Yeah.
That actually makes me think of something. Like, where do you see the most potential for solidarity between drug users, harm reduction workers, abolitionists, and other criminalized communities, and like maybe these like higher up, like what, you know what I'm trying to say? Like,
Yeah.
where
So
can
you're
we work
talking
together?
about the people with institutional power and people with less institutional power. So we need to know the difference between compassion and dignity, right? We need to know the difference between what solidarity is right? What does it mean to be in solidarity and to be a co-collaborator, right? What does it mean to understand collective care? Because in order for the people with more institutional power to be trusted, be not just be trusted to so you're saying something about solidarity, right? Like you said, yeah. You need to understand the theory. You need to put in the work, bro. Like it doesn't just show up overnight where you decide that you are going to ally with more marginalized groups, right? Because so often, I mean, we name this shit too. It doesn't impede the way it functions, right? So I can name all the fucking things in the world as a privileged person, as a white person, for example, who has, I've been through everything under the sun that makes me have no privilege and disadvantages, but I still have white privilege, right? So for me, if I can't just decide that I am going to be trusted by a Black person or a racialized person. It's not up to me, right? And I have to sit with and be okay with the fact that maybe I'm never going to be trusted because of my whiteness, right? So that same idea, it's very similar with people with institutional power. At the same time, we do need those people to risk their power and privileges to ensure that the right thing happens politically and, on a macro level, right? Because the truth is, I'm not even sure if maybe I'll disagree with this one day, but right now I'm thinking that we do need those people with more power, right? Because sometimes they can't be taking the credit for it, because we know also historically that it's academics and researchers and people with
Yeah.
power that will, just like harm reduction as a whole, like they've taken credit for a lot of these programs and these models, and then they've like sanitized the shit out of it. So like you need to be giving credit where it's due. You need to be humble enough to be uncomfortable, because most uncomfortable conversations are the most courageous conversations. I think it's the same that you would see with like other systemically excluded groups and
Yeah.
that want to come alongside, right? It's decentering yourself and being willing to disrupt and challenge things that maybe you benefit from. Even me, like, oh man, if I didn't have, I think I told you this when we were on the phone, like, dude, you know how many things I would be able to do if I didn't have to work and get paid for combating the drug war? Because so many people will say like, "Oh, you're just in it for the money." And like, listen, man,
It's
I
like,
just to get paid too, right? Like,
yeah.
you deserve to get paid because it's the fucking labor that we're doing. But if I didn't have to do this, trust me, I fucking wouldn't. Okay, and I'd be focusing on creating community. I think it's just about being humble and decentering yourself. That's at the end of the day, right? Like, not everything that you believe, being willing to disrupt a lot of the shit that you thought you believed, right? And just trusting the expertise and the leadership of people who use drugs, because that's where the answer lies.
Once you're in this work, we're going to be in this work for the rest of our lives. You can't take that label off. I just hate, especially me being young. Okay, I have to say this. Me being young, pretty, white, and like, I'm not the poster child for harm reduction. I'm the daughter of a drug addict, criminalized person. Like, he was convicted and tried and put in prison for manslaughter. Like, my mother dated him, so she wasn't well in her head either. Like, I can't be the poster child of harm reduction. I'm not a celebrity. I'm not your role model. I'm just a kid who had a dad who died of a drug overdose, who got into drugs, who thinks people deserve to live. That's literally it. You know what I mean? I feel like people see my solidarity line shit, and I'm sure it happens to you too. Like every time we make a mistake, we're like vilified for it and put on a pedestal, and it's like I'm gonna fall from that every time because I don't want to be up there.
Miriam Kaba said something really important along those lines. We do this thing with people that we pedestal because it's just what we do. I don't know why. It's fucking weird. I hate pedestaling people, but I've done it, but I try not to anymore. But what we do is we hold them to a standard that is inhuman, right? And so when they fuck up, because that happens, it's inevitable, we're human, we fuck up, then we end up going from 100 all the way down to zero. And then it's almost like it's a part of cancel culture too, right? Like
Yep,
it's a largely colonial thing. But I think at the same time, it's really necessary to exile people who are really harmful or racist or transphobic or, rapists or whatever. Like there's certain exceptions. But I think at the same time, when it
of
comes
course.
I wrote about this also. It's like I'm like, oh, I wrote about this, but
Yeah, I know. I know. A lot of my things are like based off of things that I've read that you've written about.
I love that. Thank you. And yeah, so I did talk about this too. It's like we need to stop being merciless towards one another, right? I think at the end of the day, again, with the exception of bigotry and racism and xenophobia, all that bullshit that I will never just be like, oh, I wonder what kind of day they're having. No, I'm going to tell them that they're racist and they need to unpack that and then they suffer the consequences of that. And that's just like between like relational shit, right? But what we do anyways within like relationship is when our friend or not the person that we are pedestaling no longer fits our perfect image of them, then all hell breaks loose, right? And so we need to get past that too, right? We need to see each other's humanity. And the cliche is always what's that quote? He who casts stones live in glass houses. But it's true, right? And there's so much more potential within our movements, especially within our fucking movements, because we can be really laterally violent to one another. Like a part of the reason why I left that organization actually was because the mentors that I mentioned in the beginning of our talk, the people who really taught me everything I know, the people like my big sisters, like the biggest, most important people in my life for a long time, they ended up in positions of power over me. And, you know, some shit happened where I outed a very harmful man who harmed me, you know, during a blackout, who happened to be beloved and you know, well respected within that community. On top of the fact that those people also saw me doing big things like within the movement, which shouldn't have been seen as big, it should have just been good. They ended up blocking me from leadership and telling me that I wasn't ready, that I was too aggressive online, that I wasn't equipped to do the work. And they ended up canceling me and dragging me through the mud. Right. I'm their comrade. Like we organized together. We did this work
Yeah.
together for years. And like one of them cut my son's umbilical cord, you know, and she was a lot older than me and just like a mentor, right? Like I loved her so much. But she ended up being one of the ringleaders of the dragging me through the mud and ostracizing me. But my point is that's what we do to each other, right? And the funny thing at the end of that story is that I ended up quitting and moving into a job, if you care about hierarchy, much higher than hers, where I had a little bit more power. So it's like,
Yeah.
I'm not good
Everything
enough,
works out.
I'm not ready. Well, here I am in another role. So you
Yeah.
can go deal with whatever internalized shit you're dealing with. But we do that, right? We end up crumbling our movements
Yeah.
because we don't know how to do conflict, right? And the difference or the thing that we need to know as well is like conflict's inevitable, right?
Mhm.
Conflict is always going to be a part of relationship and organizing and building, right? And we need to know the difference between conflict and harm. And the other part, when going back to like what, you know, allies or people who want to come alongside need to do, they need to know the difference between dignity and compassion, right? Because
Yeah.
dignity and respect is different than having, because when you have compassion, so I'm going back now, but when you have compassion for somebody, you still have a bit of a power thing, right? And so when you give them dignity and respect, that is equal, right? Anyways, but it's the same thing with like conflict. We get a little bit high on ourselves because we crave power, right? It's something that we do for survival, but something we need to stop doing. And we end up sabotaging and ruining relationships and really good movements because of it. And so that requires being able to sit in conflict, be uncomfortable, and just really get our shit together, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. And like when you think about this, what kind of keeps you going when these losses keep feeling so relentless? Like what has kept you from, well, I'm sure you've experienced burnout, but what keeps you going despite the burnout, despite
Oh,
the
I'm perpetually burnt out, dude.
Yeah.
I've gone to the doctor because I thought I had a fucking brain tumor, but it was just burnout.
I have
This is years ago. I've just I the first time I got burnt out was like 2016.
yeah, which is 2 years into what you were saying, like the
Yeah.
bigger role. So could you
Well,
just
because I was
imagine?
responding to death every day almost, but no, it's yeah, it's like that. We can talk, maybe have another whole conversation about the grief, right? But definitely
Yeah.
grief does. I think that grief not only burns me out, it also keeps me going, right? And I think that we have moral obligations to show up and we don't always have to be at the forefront though, right? We can step back and do different forms of organizing. can, know when to throw in the towel, know when to take a break. At the same time, being able to take breaks and step away comes with a lot of privilege, right? So what keeps me going is spite, my sense of justice, this vision of a better world, because I think it was Angela Davis who actually said this. You have to act like it is radically possible at all times for a better world, right? Like that's what we have to do. We can't lose hope, because who suffers because of that, right? And I just find it unacceptable to know the level of suffering at the hands of the state, and to not do anything about it. To me, it's just, what's the point? What's the point in even existing if I'm not, in the name of justice? For me, it makes no sense, right? It's just, I guess I'm wired in this weird way, but it also means like I gotta know my place, I know my role, I know when to decenter myself too, right? Because it's not just me talking about other people decentering. I need to decenter myself, right?
Yeah.
My comrade who's sleeping on the street, who's, experiencing different layers of systemic violence, like they should be more recognized in certain areas than I am, right? And so I think that's a lot of it. It's just, continue showing up, because it's not just like, oh, it's the right thing to do. It's just like I don't understand not doing it.
I don't know how else to live. I remember being like, yeah, I agree. I remember being a kid and I was with my mom in the car with her partner, not my stepfather that passed away, but her other partner after him. Hate that guy. Anyways, that was just a side note. But we were in the car and somebody was obviously intoxicated and they're riding a bike and they're coming towards my mom's car and they fell on the road in the middle of the road. All these cars are coming both ways. I'm like, Mom, we have to stop. She's like, they're just drunk. They're fine. I'm like, Mom, we have to stop. And I made her like pull over the car and make his name was Robbie, make Robbie go check on this guy and help him up and get back on his bike, because literally like I was gonna have a fucking like meltdown in the back of the car if she didn't stop, because there's some, and I was just a little kid. I remember I was like 10, and there's just this feeling in my chest and I feel it every day, this sense of urgency and like I need to do something. And like, I don't understand how, like, I do understand that everybody might have that, but their sense of urgency is, I need to do something. We need to call the police. When it should be, I need to do something. Let me get this
Yeah.
person a hot meal or something nice so they can survive the day. You know what I mean? And I think everybody's coming from the same feeling in your chest, the same want for somebody to do something and be better. You know what I mean? Like for the world to be better. But if you want the world to be better, you have to respect people, like you're saying, have dignity, have compassion, have all these things. But if you could speak directly to people in power, or like just people in the streets that might not understand what we understand, the people shaping drug policy right now, what truth do you think they're refusing to face? Like, what would you want to say to them?
Man, that's a loaded question, but it's so
I
real.
know.
But I like it. I don't want anything else. It's such a simple thought that comes to my head. It's like, stop drinking the Kool-Aid, right? I just talked earlier about how Bonnie Henry, our provincial health officer, has recommended safer supply and completely abolishing the drug war, right? And so is Lisa Lapointe. It's really troubling to me how BC's government and government altogether, everywhere, isn't required to follow evidence. You know what I mean? Like that's really troubling, because you'd think
It's terrifying.
yeah, logically evidence would be the best way forward, because it's just obvious, right? And so what would I want people to think or know? It's people who use drugs have the answer, right? People who use drugs have always had the answer, and all hell's not going to break loose if and when we eradicate the drug war. That is a myth that is based on moral panic. There's no evidence to support that. And it's time to take the wool over our eyes and be willing to be uncomfortable, right? Remember when I talked about how clinicians sometimes, like, not just clinicians, but yeah, clinicians who learn about harm reduction, I think sometimes the reason why, in my observations, why clinicians who had power didn't want people with lived experience having the same power was because it disrupted their sense of benevolence, right? It disrupted their idea that they were the helper versus the helped, right? And then when they're equal, it takes away their sense of like worth, right? But
And plus their sense of power
sense of
too.
power, yeah, it's because
Yeah.
we, like humans, because of our survival and fear, we want power, right? Like we're afraid of sharing power and we're afraid of losing power. But the other thing that I'm thinking of is was just talking about power. I think that idea goes hand in hand, though, with governments, right? We know that, again, I'm repeating myself here, but the drug war exists, it serves a purpose to the state, right? Because how are we going to inflate police budgets if we end the drug war, right? How are we going to justify disposability politics, right? So what I wish politicians would do would to stop drinking the Kool-Aid and be brave. But this is the same thing. Like I have no illusion that politicians are going to do anything, right? So on one hand, I want them to stop drinking the Kool-Aid. I want them to realize that the answer is far more simple and it's not going to cause havoc in our communities. As a matter of fact, it will reduce harm within our communities because people will stop doing crime. People will have safe places to use. There's less death rates. The healthcare system is stretched thin already, so it'll help that. Thank you. And the other part of that, it's like we know the benefits because there's endless research. Like it's there, right? All you got to do is look it up. There's far more research that shows that safer supply, universal basic income, and all the elements required for wellness that I mentioned today will actually greatly improve society, right? It will greatly improve wellness. So people need to know that because we need to stop putting the wool over our eyes and seeing that because we know what the truth is. So it's about being brave. At the same time, what I want from politicians is to leave people, groups, drug user liberation groups, the fuck alone and stop criminalizing them, right? Because sometimes, even though I have these wishes, if you know, for a perfect world of how I want the government to respond,
Which I'm gonna ask about.
I
Last
also
question.
we don't want government involved. We just want to be left the fuck alone because we know how
Yeah,
to.
yeah.
Yeah.
I muted myself. Yeah. So that actually ties into the last question I have for you. What do you think a future built around drug user autonomy and collective care should look like in your point of view? And what do you think it'll take for us to get there? Like kind of what you just mentioned. Like basically, like how you said, like we don't want the government involved. We want to be in control of our own care. Like, is that what you think would be a future that's built around drug user autonomy? Like, is that what we need to start doing? Like, do you know what I'm trying to
I
ask?
think we need to stop asking for permission for sure, right?
Yeah.
We need to stop pandering to, you know, the ruling class and being diplomatic with white supremacy. We also need, because the truth is, you know, a lot of people within these drug user movements are doing the things that I was describing earlier around conflict, right? So it means putting effort into undoing our our lateral violence and stopping lateral violence, stopping the ego bullshit, stop pandering to the ruling class, stop licking the boots of those who wouldn't piss on you if you were on fire. Yes, keep that one. And really, though, it requires us getting our shit together because we are like I think some of the most harmful pieces of the movements is not the movements themselves, it's the conflict, right? It's the way that we mercilessly attack each other and, you know, instead of, you know, exiling each other, sometimes people do, like I said, it's just about we need to put more effort into being more
Constructive
comfortable.
communicating.
Just build those skills. Like stop acting like you got it all figured out. None of
Yeah.
us do,
Yeah.
right? Start showing up and read. This is the other thing. Read the theory. Read Bell Hooks and Angela Davis and Miriam Kaba and Dean Spade. Like don't just because this anti-intellectualism is happening too,
Yeah,
right?
I've
Learn.
noticed that too.
It needs to happen. We none of us got it all figured out.
Oh,
Right?
and that's like we need to collaborate. We need the scientists, we need the doctors, we need like the everybody to back up the shit that we already know is true. Because if, like you said, if you hear it from a drug user, nobody's gonna believe you. But then if you have a drug user and a doctor saying the same thing, like they're kind of
And at the same time, sometimes it's like fuck the doctors too,
yeah, yeah,
asking for permission and
exactly. Yeah.
right? There's a very for me in my own life, like I know maybe two, three doctors that I'm lucky to know who aren't cops. The
Hmm.
rest of them, I was just let down by two
Yeah.
doctors that I was organizing with because they didn't want their name attached to something that I said, you know? And it's like, okay, well, you know, what's the limit of your solidarity then?
Yeah. Yeah,
Really, there's
exactly.
right? So that's the other thing, right? Like there's a lot of nuance around the conversation of doctors and having people with institutional power. And if you are a person with institutional power, then you better
Pick a
better
side.
used to being comfortable because
Yeah.
in discomfort and a
Yeah.
lot of risks is the more fucking power you have, the more privilege you have, the more you must risk.
And the more you have to
It's like
lose.
who gets left out of that if you don't, right?
Yeah. And then, yes, Anne Livingston said that too. She's like, we need to stop waiting for permission. I didn't wait for permission. I just did it. And it's like, and if you want something done, you're going to have to do it yourself because the government isn't coming to save you.
That's exactly it. The government isn't coming to save you, and we fucking should know that a long time ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
But
that
yeah,
goes, yeah, sorry, just
no,
going
go ahead. Go ahead. No, go.
person from Ontario that came and reached out to me a couple years ago who said, this is just one little message, who said, I'm so for all religions, but they said God spoke to me and that I was supposed to come to the downtown east side to help people, right? And, the first thing I said was, what makes you think that you're going to have the answers to things, right? The downtown east side is going to help itself. If you want to show up, elevate, right? So it's also like getting your head out of your ass and thinking that you're going to have a solution to things that people have been fighting for decades, right?
The solution is right in front of our face. They know what the solution is and they don't want to do it because they profit off the death.
But yeah, there's so many different pieces of
Yeah.
that. And it's a lot of it's really complex at the same time. There's a lot of very, very clear solutions, and it's just stop the moral panic, stop drinking the Kool-Aid, and
That's what the title of this episode is going to be called, by the way. Stop drinking the Kool-Aid.
that they probably 17 times already.
No,
So
I love that. That's so that like honestly, it's corny, but it's profound. You know what I mean? Like it actually makes sense. You know?
please do that. I love this.
But yeah, do you want to tell anybody where they can find your work? So if you want to end this off here, we can. If you have more to say, feel free.
I wanted to say so much more, but I'm like, I don't know where my brain's at right now. Stop drinking the Kool-Aid. There's something. Oh, the other thing is it's also for drug users. I think what I've noticed is drug users in those drug using spaces, not only within conflict themselves, but I notice a lot blame like other marginalized groups for some of their problems, right? And so this is a message for anybody who's mostly white, who has, any beefs with, immigrants or racialized people or plus, it's time to cut that shit out and understand what it means to be in solidarity and that everybody's liberation is bound with one another.
If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. If you have come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together.
Yes, our liberation is bound together, and that was Lila Watson. I just always want to make sure I quote because if it's especially a Black organizer or a Black voice, I don't want to leave that out. Yeah, so I think that's it. And then if anything else,
Indigenous Australian activist. That's who it is.
Indigenous Australian activist. Okay, awesome. Yeah, so anybody who wants to follow me, I'm Femme Against the Machine on Instagram, and you can find me Heather Ingersdóttir on Substack and any other platform. It's probably going to be Femme Against the Machine. So
cool. Yeah. Well, thank you. The reason I made this podcast is because overdoses are not accidents. They're political. They are political decisions made within colonial systems that decide whose lives are worth saving, who gets to live or die. And yeah, if this was heavy for you, talk to somebody. There's a lot of resources that you can find probably in your own city, but if you're in Hamilton, Ontario, definitely reach out to Coast. They're our crisis line. I'm gonna Google what it is because I don't have it in front of me. Coast. The number is 905-972-8338, and it is a crisis outreach and support team. So if you need help after listening to this, please reach out. And you can check out more of my work at Solidarity Alliance of People Who Use Drugs. My name is Kayla Haggerty. And also on my own social media, my personal social media is not affiliated with my Solidarity Alliance. I'm my own entity. And that's at The Real King's Theory Media. But yeah, thank you for listening.
Yay, thank you, Kayla.